My mother-in-law hung a banner across her dining room that read, "Finally Free," the same week my divorce was finalized, hosting a full celebration dinner with extended family and neighbors specifically to mark the occasion of my husband officially, legally leaving me behind. I found out about that party by accident, through a mutual acquaintance who assumed I already knew, and something in me decided in that exact moment that I wasn't simply going to disappear quietly from their lives the way they clearly expected. What Harriet Pemberton didn't know, laughing and toasting champagne glasses that evening, was that the contractor scheduled to arrive at her house the following morning had been working, for the past 8 months, entirely on my dime. Stick with me, because that celebration dinner was about to become the last happy moment the Pemberton family experienced for quite some time. My name is Aurelia Kessner. I'm 32 years old, and for 6 years, I was married to Grayson Pemberton, a man whose family had always treated me with a particular blend of surface politeness and underlying dismissal that I'd genuinely mistaken, for far too long, as simply their reserved, old-fashioned family temperament rather than the calculated exclusion it actually represented. Roughly 8 months before that celebration dinner, long before Grayson and I had even begun discussing divorce, I'd quietly arranged to fund a substantial home renovation for Harriet and Stanley Pemberton's aging house, a gesture I'd offered genuinely, out of real affection for the family despite their consistent coolness toward me, hoping perhaps that this significant financial gift might finally demonstrate my genuine commitment to being considered a real valued member of their family, rather than simply Grayson's wife by legal technicality. That renovation, a substantial kitchen and bathroom overhaul contracted through Bishop & Sons Construction, remained entirely unfinished at the time of our divorce, funded through payments I'd personally arranged and continued making directly, payments neither Grayson nor his parents had ever bothered fully understanding the actual source of, having simply assumed throughout those 8 months that the renovation was somehow covered through their own family resources or perhaps some vague arrangement between Grayson and his parents that nobody had actually bothered examining closely. Grayson and I met 7 years ago, married relatively quickly after a whirlwind courtship that genuinely felt, at the time, like the beginning of a lifelong partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. His family, though, revealed themselves gradually, over those subsequent years, as considerably more complicated than the warm, welcoming impression they'd initially projected throughout our engagement and early marriage. Harriet Pemberton, my mother-in-law, maintained what I eventually recognized as a carefully calibrated coolness toward me throughout our entire marriage, warm enough during public family gatherings to avoid obvious criticism, but consistently distant during private moments in ways that made clear repeatedly that she'd never fully considered me a genuine member of the family despite 6 years of marriage to her only son. Stanley Pemberton, Grayson's father, remained largely passive throughout most family dynamics, deferring almost entirely to Harriet's judgment regarding both major family decisions and the particular social hierarchy she'd established within their extended family circle, a hierarchy that consistently positioned me somewhere near the bottom despite my genuine, consistent efforts throughout our marriage to build meaningful relationships with both of them. I threw myself into demonstrating genuine commitment to the family throughout those 6 years, hosting holiday gatherings, remembering birthdays and anniversaries meticulously, and eventually, offering that substantial renovation gift specifically hoping it might finally shift the family's underlying perception of me from tolerated outsider into genuinely valued family member, a hope that, in hindsight, revealed considerably more about my own unresolved need for their approval than any realistic expectation regarding how they would actually respond. I'd initiated the renovation project roughly 8 months before our divorce, motivated partly by genuine concern regarding the Pembertons' aging kitchen and bathroom facilities, which had grown increasingly outdated and, in several specific instances, genuinely unsafe given some deteriorating electrical wiring Stanley had mentioned, almost in passing, during a family dinner several months earlier. I contacted Bishop & Sons Construction directly, working with the company's owner, Nathan Bishop, to design a comprehensive renovation plan that would address both the immediate safety concerns and provide the Pembertons with genuinely updated, comfortable living spaces they could enjoy throughout their remaining years in that family home. I structured the payment arrangement carefully, establishing a dedicated account funded entirely through my own separate savings, distinct from our joint marital finances, specifically because I wanted this particular gift to remain unambiguously entirely my own generous contribution rather than something drawn from resources Grayson might later claim equal credit for providing. I never fully explained the specific funding source directly to Harriet or Stanley, largely because Grayson had suggested, early in the planning process, that presenting the renovation as a family gift, without specifying the exact financial arrangement, might feel less awkward or transactional for his parents, advice I now recognize in hindsight as reflecting his own broader pattern of allowing his family to assume things worked in their favor without ever bothering to correct inaccurate assumptions that ultimately benefited him and his family at my direct expense. Roughly 4 months into that renovation project, considerably before its anticipated completion, Grayson informed me, with a coldness that genuinely stunned me given our previously stable marriage, that he wanted a divorce, citing vague, difficult-to-address complaints about feeling unfulfilled, and wanting to explore who he actually was outside our marriage. I later learned, through a painful series of revelations during our subsequent divorce proceedings, that Grayson had been conducting an affair for several months with a woman he'd met through his workplace, an affair that had apparently prompted his sudden, previously unexplained desire to end our marriage despite 6 years of what I genuinely believed was a stable, committed partnership. Harriet and Stanley, rather than expressing any genuine concern regarding their son's infidelity or the broader collapse of a 6-year marriage, instead rallied immediately and completely around Grayson throughout the entire divorce process, treating me increasingly as an obstacle to be efficiently removed rather than a person genuinely grieving the end of a significant relationship, regardless of how that relationship had ultimately concluded. I continued the renovation payments throughout this entire difficult period, initially out of simple inertia and continued genuine affection for Harriet and Stanley specifically, despite the mounting evidence that neither Grayson nor his parents genuinely valued my presence within their family beyond whatever practical or financial benefit I happened to provide during any given period. Our divorce proceedings moved forward over the following months, Grayson's family maintaining consistent, unified support for his position throughout every stage, while I navigated the genuinely difficult process largely without the family support I'd spent 6 years attempting to cultivate, relying instead on my own close friends and eventually, a capable divorce attorney who helped me protect my separate financial assets, including the renovation funding account I'd established independently. Months earlier, the final settlement reflected an equitable division of our genuinely joint marital assets, while confirming clearly, through documentation my attorney carefully prepared, that the renovation funding remained entirely my own separate financial contribution, never formally transferred or gifted directly to either Grayson or his parents through any binding legal arrangement. I continued the renovation payments even after our divorce formally finalized, genuinely uncertain, throughout those final weeks, whether to simply discontinue funding a project that increasingly felt disconnected from any remaining relationship with the family it was intended to benefit, ultimately deciding to complete at least the current phase of work already underway before making any final decision regarding the project's future. It was during this uncertain period, roughly 2 weeks after our divorce formally finalized, that I learned, through a mutual acquaintance who assumed I'd already been informed, about the celebration dinner Harriet was actively planning to mark the occasion of Grayson's successful escape from our marriage. The mutual acquaintance, a neighbor named Priscilla who had always maintained cordial relations with both me and the broader Pemberton family, mentioned the party almost casually during an unrelated conversation, describing details about catering arrangements and a banner Harriet had apparently commissioned specifically celebrating Grayson's newfound freedom. I sat with that information for several genuinely painful days, processing both the immediate hurt of learning my former in-laws were actively celebrating my marriage's collapse, and the broader, more complicated realization regarding exactly how little my 6 years of genuine effort and financial generosity toward their family had ultimately meant to any of them. I thought carefully during those difficult days about the ongoing renovation project, about the considerable financial resources I'd already invested toward improving a home belonging to people who were, at that very moment, apparently celebrating my complete removal from their family's life with champagne and catered appetizers. I made a decision during those difficult days of processing that felt considerably less like calculated revenge and more like simple, reasonable reconsideration regarding whether I genuinely wanted to continue funding significant home improvements for a family who had made abundantly, unmistakably clear exactly how little genuine value they'd ever actually placed on my presence within their lives. I contacted Nathan Bishop directly, explaining honestly and clearly that given my recent divorce from Grayson Pemberton, I would be discontinuing funding for the renovation project effective immediately, requesting that his crew halt any further work pending a final settlement regarding materials and labor already completed through that point. Nathan, genuinely surprised by this development, mentioned that his crew had actually been scheduled to arrive at the Pemberton residence the following morning specifically to install several expensive custom cabinet pieces that had just arrived from their supplier, cabinets that represented a significant portion of the overall renovation budget and required final payment confirmation before installation could proceed. I explained the full situation to Nathan directly, that Harriet and Stanley likely had no genuine understanding regarding the actual funding source behind their renovation, having apparently assumed throughout the entire project that either Grayson or some combination of family resources was covering the substantial costs involved, rather than understanding clearly that every single payment had originated entirely from my own separate, independent finances. Nathan, professional but understandably concerned about his crew's own compensation for work already completed, indicated he would need to visit the property directly the following morning regardless, both to address the cabinet installation question and to clarify, directly with whoever was present, the project's actual current funding status before any additional work could reasonably proceed. The celebration dinner, as it turned out, was scheduled for that same Saturday evening, meaning Nathan's crew arrived at the Pemberton residence early Saturday morning, hours before Harriet's planned festivities, specifically to address the cabinet installation and clarify the project's funding status directly with Harriet and Stanley. According to Nathan's later account, Harriet answered the door that morning still in the midst of party preparations, confused initially about why a construction crew was arriving unannounced, before Nathan explained clearly and professionally that the project's funding, which he'd understood throughout their entire working relationship to be arranged through Aurelia Kessner directly, had been formally discontinued given her recent divorce from Grayson, and that final payment arrangements needed clarification before any additional work, including the scheduled cabinet installation, could proceed. Harriet's confusion, according to Nathan, shifted rapidly into visible distress as she processed this information, apparently never having genuinely understood that the substantial renovation her home had been undergoing for the past 8 months had been funded entirely through my own separate resources rather than any arrangement involving Grayson or the family's own finances, an assumption that had, apparently, gone entirely unquestioned and unexamined throughout the entire project. Stanley, drawn into the conversation once Harriet's distress became evident, reportedly grew increasingly agitated himself once the full financial situation became clear, particularly upon learning that several $1,000s in custom cabinetry currently sitting in Nathan's truck would remain unpaid and consequently unavailable for installation, unless alternative funding arrangements could be established considerably more quickly than their Saturday evening celebration timeline realistically allowed. By the time guests began arriving that Saturday evening for Harriet's planned celebration, the household atmosphere had shifted dramatically from celebratory anticipation into something considerably more tense and uncertain. Half-finished renovation work visible throughout the kitchen area where cabinet installation had been expected to complete just that morning, exposed wiring and unfinished surfaces creating an uncomfortable visual contrast against Harriet's carefully planned party decorations. Several guests, according to accounts I later received through mutual acquaintances who'd attended, noticed the obvious construction disarray and began asking pointed questions regarding the renovation's apparent incompleteness, questions that gradually revealed, throughout the evening's uncomfortable conversations, the broader financial situation Harriet had clearly hoped to avoid discussing during what was intended as a purely celebratory gathering. Grayson himself, according to these same accounts, grew visibly uncomfortable as guests continued raising questions about the unfinished renovation, apparently having also never fully understood or acknowledged the actual funding arrangement I'd established, instead having simply assumed, much like his parents, that the renovation costs were somehow being absorbed by his family's general resources rather than understanding the specific, considerable financial gift I'd personally provided. Throughout our marriage's final months, the celebration that had been specifically designed to mark Grayson's freedom from our marriage instead became, through this entirely unplanned but genuinely fitting coincidence, an uncomfortable, publicly visible demonstration of exactly how much the Pemberton family had actually relied upon my genuine generosity throughout our marriage, generosity they had apparently felt entirely comfortable accepting while simultaneously celebrating my complete removal from their family's ongoing life. I eventually agreed, roughly 2 weeks after that disrupted celebration, to complete payment for the already purchased cabinet materials specifically, Wanting to avoid leaving Nathan Bishop's construction company financially disadvantaged for work and materials that predated my decision to discontinue further funding, while declining entirely to fund any additional renovation phases beyond that already committed material purchase. Harriet reached out to me directly during this period, her tone carrying a genuinely uncomfortable mixture of embarrassment and reluctant gratitude, acknowledging, for what felt like the first time throughout our entire 6-year relationship, the actual scope of what I'd contributed toward her family's home and life throughout my marriage to her son, an acknowledgement that arrived, unfortunately, considerably too late to meaningfully repair a relationship that had never genuinely valued me, beyond whatever practical benefit I happened to provide. I declined any further involvement in completing the renovation beyond that already committed cabinet payment, choosing instead to redirect my own financial resources and emotional energy entirely toward rebuilding my own independent life, purchasing a modest home of my own and beginning genuine, meaningful therapy to process both my marriage's collapse and the broader pattern of seeking approval from people who had never genuinely valued my presence within their family regardless of how much I'd continued offering throughout those difficult years. Standing in my own new home roughly a year later, genuinely secure and independent for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I thought often about that celebration dinner Harriet had planned so carefully to mark my removal from their family's life, and about the strange, entirely unplanned way that unfinished kitchen renovation had ultimately revealed, publicly and unmistakably, exactly how much genuine value I'd actually provided throughout years the Pemberton family had apparently never once genuinely appreciated. I didn't need their belated recognition to feel whole again. I'd already learned through that entire difficult experience precisely how much my own generosity was actually worth, and precisely how important it remained to reserve that generosity, going forward, for people genuinely capable of appreciating it.